He searched for his daughter for 4 years. Neither the police nor volunteers found any trace of her. But one chance discovery in a lake changed everything. Subscribe and write in the comments which city you are watching from. Rachel Whitman had always been a quiet presence in any room she entered, a young woman whose inner world seemed vaster and deeper than the space she physically occupied. Born in a small town to Michael Whitman and his wife Laura, she grew up knowing the kind of love that was constant but unspoken. When she was 9 years old, a rain-slick highway and the shattering sound of twisted metal took her mother away forever. From that day forward, it was just Rachel and her father, learning in their own ways how to fill the silence that loss had left behind. Michael was never one for grand speeches, and Rachel inherited his quiet resilience. They shared a mutual understanding built on glances, on shared tasks, on evenings spent in companionable silence, each knowing that the other was there. While other children in her class joined soccer teams, went to birthday parties, and filled their days with chatter, Rachel would disappear into the woods behind their home, a notebook in hand. She mapped small trails, marked trees with sketches, and cataloged the calls of the birds she learned to recognize by ear. The forest, with its unhurried rhythm and absence of human noise, became the place where she felt most at ease. In high school, she was the girl with the well-worn hiking boots in her locker and topo maps tucked between the pages of her textbooks. Friends came and went, never quite understanding why she would choose the solitude of the hills over a night out. It wasn't that Rachel disliked people. She simply felt the world made more sense when she was away from them. By her early 20s, she had developed a disciplined approach to the wilderness. She wasn't impulsive. Every hike, every overnight, every extended trek was prepared for in meticulous detail. She studied maps until the contour lines seemed to rise from the paper. She read about weather patterns, local wildlife, and survival techniques. Her pack was a compact gallery of efficiency, carefully rationed dried food, a small water filtration system, a compass, a portable solar panel for her phone and GPS device, and a bright yellow sleeping bag her father had given her for her last birthday. That sleeping bag had been wrapped in paper decorated with pine trees, Michael's attempt at a personal touch. She had laughed when she'd opened it, telling him she'd never lose something so bright out in the forest. When Rachel told her father she was planning a solo trip into the vast stretches of one of the country's largest national forests, Michael didn't try to stop her. He knew his daughter, knew her carefulness, her ability to think ahead. They agreed on one condition. Every 72 hours, she would send him a brief message, 3 simple words. "I'm all right." That was all he needed to sleep at night. She finalized her itinerary, shared the printed route with him, and noted potential areas where she could get a cell signal. The trip was to last about 2 weeks, just her and the deep, green silence she loved. On the morning of her departure, Michael insisted on driving her to the trailhead. It was early September, the kind of day that felt balanced between seasons, warm sunlight and a cool breeze carrying the scent of pine. She sat in the passenger seat of the old SUV, her backpack resting at her feet. The yellow sleeping bag rolled neatly and clipped to the outside. She wore a violet windbreaker, the color standing out against the muted greens and browns of the landscape they passed. The drive was long, and conversation was sparse, as it often was between them, but it was not an uncomfortable silence. When they arrived, Michael parked in the small gravel lot at the trail's entrance. A wooden bridge spanned a narrow stream just a short distance into the woods, and Rachel shouldered her pack, adjusted her trekking poles, and walked beside him to that point. There she paused, one hand resting lightly on the railing, and turned to face him. He pulled out his phone and took her picture. Rachel framed by the bridge, the forest behind her, deep and inviting. Her expression was calm, steady, with a trace of a smile. He noticed the way the sunlight cut through the leaves and landed on her shoulder, a warm slash of gold against the violet of her jacket. She looked like she belonged there. That photograph would become the last image he would ever take of her. She stepped away after that, crossing the bridge with the ease of someone walking into a familiar place. Michael watched her go until the forest swallowed her figure, the sound of her footsteps fading under the murmur of the stream. He returned to his vehicle with a heaviness in his chest, though he told himself it was nothing more than the weight of parting. For the first 3 days, he wasn't concerned when no message came. He imagined her deep in the forest, setting up camp near a hidden clearing, too far from any signal to check in. On the fourth day, his mind began to circle around a growing unease. He found himself pulling out his phone over and over, refreshing the screen, looking for her name. By the fifth day, he was checking every few minutes, telling himself it was just a glitch. But his thoughts kept returning to her reliability. Rachel was not the kind of person to forget an agreement, especially with him. On the morning of the sixth day, he sat at the kitchen table with a mug of coffee cooling untouched before him. The early sunlight streamed through the blinds, but its warmth did nothing to quiet the fear that had taken root in his chest. By mid-morning, Michael was at the local police station. He explained the situation calmly but firmly, providing the itinerary, the printed maps, the list of her gear. He handed over the photograph he'd taken on the bridge, pointing out the bright yellow sleeping bag clipped to her pack. The officer listened, nodded, took notes. But Michael could read the subtext in the man's eyes. This was not yet an emergency in their minds. Hikers often came in late, he was told. People lost track of time. Still, the case was referred to the county sheriff's department responsible for the forest area, and Michael went home to wait for their call. It came later that afternoon, the voice on the other end telling him that a preliminary search could be conducted based on the information he'd provided. Michael couldn't sit still. He booked a flight for the next morning, unwilling to lose another day. By dawn, he was back near the trailhead, standing with forest rangers and search and rescue volunteers as they organized the initial sweep. They started with the parking lot. Her rental car was still there, locked, untouched. From that point on, she had simply vanished. Over the following days, the search expanded, teams combing established trails, side paths, steep ridges, and shallow creeks. Helicopters scanned from above while dogs worked through the undergrowth. They followed her planned route as closely as possible, marking off areas already searched. Each evening, Michael returned to a small motel nearby, his mind replaying every detail he had given them, wondering what else might help. A week passed with nothing. No footprints, no discarded gear, no remnants of a campfire. It was as though she had stepped into the forest and been swallowed whole. The forest, which had always been her refuge, now felt like an adversary withholding its secrets. Michael stayed, refusing to leave while the search continued. He accompanied teams during the day, sometimes venturing into less mapped areas on his own, though the rangers cautioned him against it. At night, he sat in his room, scrolling through her old messages, staring at the photo of her on the bridge, trying to memorize every detail in case it meant something later. After 3 weeks, the official search began to wind down. Every plausible route had been covered more than once. The likelihood that she had simply gotten lost or suffered an accident seemed smaller by the day. Some whispered other possibilities: an encounter with a dangerous stranger, an unforeseen event that left no trace. Michael heard the words but refused to let them take root. To him, she was still out there, waiting to be found. And so, while the official teams packed up their gear and the case shifted from active search to missing person file, Michael made a silent decision. He would not go home. Michael Whitman did not leave when the search teams folded their maps and packed their equipment into trucks. The day the official operation was declared suspended, he stood at the edge of the gravel lot where he had last seen his daughter, watching the final rescue van disappear down the road. The air was cool, heavy with the scent of pine needles, and the forest behind him stood silent and indifferent. He could not return to the house they had shared, where every room would echo with her absence. The thought of sitting in his kitchen in the city, waiting for a phone call that might never come, felt like surrender. Instead, he rented a small single-bedroom apartment in the nearest town to the trailhead. It was nothing more than 4 walls and a thin mattress on a metal frame, but it gave him a base from which to keep searching. The room was spare, but one corner he claimed for Rachel. On a small table, he placed the printed maps of her route, a framed copy of the photo from the bridge, and a folder thick with every note, receipt, and scrap of information related to her trip. He recreated her bedroom on a smaller scale, her favorite blanket folded neatly, a few books she'd read as a teenager, and a pair of well-worn hiking boots resting in the corner. It was less a memorial than a declaration that she was not gone, only absent. In the first months, Michael followed the same rhythm the rescue teams had used, hiking out each morning with a pack of water, energy bars, and a GPS unit he had taught himself to operate. He studied topographic maps late into the night, tracing contour lines with his finger until they were imprinted in his mind. He began breaking the forest into sections, marking grids with colored pins and notes on a wall-sized map. Each day he chose a square to search, moving methodically through the terrain-up ridges, along creek beds, into thickets where the undergrowth pulled at his clothes and slowed his steps. The work was grueling. By the end of the first winter, his body had changed. His hands grew calloused from constant contact with branches and rock, his skin weathered by wind and sun. At 56, he no longer had the stamina of youth, but what he lacked in speed he made up for with persistence. Every snapped twig, every scrap of fabric caught on bark, every indentation in the earth was examined, photographed, and cataloged. Most of it amounted to nothing discarded trash from campers, signs of deer and elk, the random debris of years in the wild, but he could not risk ignoring any potential clue. In the second year, Michael began to reach out to others. He joined online forums for missing persons cases, posting Rachel's photo and the details of her trip. He connected with volunteer search and rescue hobbyists, some of whom agreed to spend weekends combing the forest with him. For a time, there was a sense of momentum, of shared purpose. But as the weeks passed without new leads, people began to drift away. Their own lives demanded attention. Michael understood. Pain could be shared for a while, but no one could carry the weight indefinitely except the person to whom it belonged. He stopped asking for help and learned to work alone. The seasons cycled: spring thaw, summer heat, autumn rains, winter frost, and still he walked. In town, people began to recognize him. The tall, graying man in a worn jacket with a map tube slung over his shoulder, heading toward the forest at first light. They spoke to him politely in the grocery store, but avoided lingering. They knew who he was and why he was there, but they didn't say her name. At night, Michael tried other avenues. He sent emails to local and national media outlets, attaching photographs and timelines. A few reporters responded, expressing interest, but most of those conversations ended with a gentle refusal. Too long ago, they said, not enough to build a story on. He wrote to producers of investigative television programs, some of whom returned courteous rejections, others never replied. He posted regularly on social media, sharing old photos of Rachel, recounting the details of her last known movements, urging anyone with information to come forward. The posts were shared a few times, liked by strangers who left brief messages of sympathy and then faded into the endless scroll. By the third year, he could feel his body beginning to resist the constant exertion. His knees ached on steep descents, and his vision blurred after long hours staring at maps in dim light. Still, he refused to stop. Every morning, he rose before dawn, drank black coffee at his kitchen counter, and studied his notes before heading out. There was no ceremony to it anymore, no expectation of sudden revelation, just the steady act of showing up, as though the forest might one day decide he had earned the answer. He kept Rachel's old phone charged, though its number had long been reassigned by the carrier. In a desk drawer, he stored her laptop, still containing the files she'd used to plan her trip. On difficult nights, he opened those folders, rereading her itineraries, her gear lists, her saved weather forecasts. He imagined her sitting at her desk in the weeks before the trip, unaware that each keystroke was one step closer to the point where her trail would vanish. 4 years after she disappeared, Michael was still there. His apartment looked much the same as it had when he'd first moved in. Bare walls, a narrow bed, and that one corner devoted entirely to her. His map of the forest was now covered in colored pins, nearly every square mile marked with notes. Yet he knew there were still places he hadn't reached, places where dense vegetation or dangerous terrain made progress slow. Those gaps kept him moving, kept the idea alive that she might be somewhere beyond them, waiting. By then, the locals had stopped asking questions. His presence had become part of the backdrop of their lives, a constant figure walking toward the tree line. They didn't know what he hoped to find after all this time, and he didn't offer explanations. The forest was still there, vast and unmoved, holding whatever truth it had chosen to keep. And Michael, bound to that truth, kept walking toward it, one step at a time. It was during the height of a humid summer in the fourth year of his vigil that something finally shifted. Not in the forest, not in any of the places he had searched, but far from the trailhead where Rachel had last been seen. The call came on an ordinary morning, while Michael was lacing his boots for another day in the woods. It was from someone he did not know, a voice telling him about a discovery at a remote lake, a yellow shape beneath the surface, bright even in the dim, refracted light. The details were still vague, but Michael felt his chest tighten as the voice spoke. Yellow. The color had once been a promise that she would always be visible in the wild. Now it might mean something else entirely. The summer air was heavy that morning, the kind that clung to the skin and made the horizon shimmer. Michael Whitman had woken before dawn, as he always did, his body conditioned to the same routine after years of repetition. He had brewed a pot of coffee, studied his maps under the pale glow of the desk lamp, and decided on the next section of forest to search. His boots were already laced when the phone rang, the sudden sound breaking the quiet in a way that felt almost intrusive. He didn't recognize the number, but he answered anyway, the habit of someone who could not afford to ignore any possibility. The voice on the other end belonged to a young man who spoke quickly, his words tumbling out in uneven bursts. He said his name was Mark and that he was a student at a nearby university. That morning, while fishing at a remote lake far from the main roads, he had noticed something unusual beneath the water surface. At first, it had seemed like an oddly bright patch of algae or a scrap of fabric, but as the sunlight shifted, it became clear that it was something man-made. Yellow, he said, large, and strange enough to make him uneasy. His father, a retired police officer, had been with him and had told him not to touch it, to leave the area immediately and call the authorities. Michael listened in silence, his grip tightening around the phone. Yellow. The word landed like a stone in his chest. It had been 4 years since he had last seen that color rolled neatly at the base of his daughter's pack, a detail from another life, one that had traveled with him every day since she disappeared. He asked the young man to repeat the location. When he heard it, he realized it was nowhere near Rachel's planned route miles from where she had set out, separated from the forest by ridges and valleys in time. By the time he reached the lake, the area had already been cordoned off. Yellow police tape fluttered faintly in the humid breeze, and uniformed officers stood at the perimeter, their radios crackling. A dive team was unloading gear from a van, their movements brisk and purposeful. The lake itself was glassy and still, its surface reflecting the pale sky above. It was the kind of place that might have seemed peaceful under other circumstances, but here the quiet felt tense, as though the water was holding its breath. He stayed back as the divers slipped into the lake, their wetsuits glinting dark against the pale shimmer of the surface. For long minutes, there was nothing, just the slow drift of ripples and the occasional hum of a radio. Then, one of the divers broke the surface, gesturing to the team on shore. A second diver rose beside him, and between them, they began to guide something upward, the shape distorted by the water until it breached into the air. It was a sleeping bag, yellow though dulled by years under the surface. The fabric was mottled with patches of algae, and strands of lakeweed clung to it like fingers reluctant to let go. Thick, rusted wire had been wrapped tightly around it, and 2 circular weight plates were fastened at each end with corroded metal clamps. Even from where he stood, Michael could see the heaviness of it, the way the divers struggled slightly under its waterlogged mass as they lifted it into a boat. The sleeping bag was laid out on a tarp near the shore. Officers moved in, gloves on, speaking in low voices as they cut through the wire and removed the weights. The air was thick with the metallic scent of wet metal and something else beneath it, something sour and unmistakable. Michael didn't need to be told what was inside. The set of the officer's shoulders, the sudden quiet around the scene told him. When they opened it, the shape inside was no longer anything like what it had been in life. Years underwater had reduced it to something unrecognizable to all but the most trained eyes. The remains were small enough to suggest they did not belong to Rachel, but the confirmation came quickly from those who could read the signs without guessing. The body was male. For Michael, the words fell into a strange space between relief and dread. It wasn't her, but it was someone, and he couldn't escape the question of how that someone had come to be wrapped in the sleeping bag he had given his daughter. In the days that followed, the body was identified as Daniel Moore, a 30-year-old man from another state who had gone missing in the same month and year as Rachel. He had vanished hundreds of miles away, his disappearance a separate mystery that had also grown cold. The discovery of his remains inside Rachel's sleeping bag was a thread that seemed to tie two unrelated cases together in a knot no one had expected. Detectives traced back through old records, piecing together what they could of Daniel's final days. It was a painstaking process, combing through fragments of evidence left to gather dust for years. The breakthrough came when they found that both Daniel and Rachel had been registered at a small roadside motel during the same week in early September. The motel was far off the main highways, a place that did not appear on tourist maps, and the names they had signed in with were not their own. Daniel's name was a false one. So was Rachel's. That discovery shifted the investigation from two missing persons cases to something far more complex. The link between them pointed to a third man, Thomas Cade. His name had surfaced before in connection with small-time criminal operations, mostly involving transport of illegal goods. Cade had never served a long sentence, but he had been arrested more than once for charges related to intimidation, theft, and suspected trafficking. Finding Cade took time. He had lived in several different states in the years since Rachel and Daniel had disappeared, never staying in one place for long. When they finally tracked him down, he was living under an alias in a rundown apartment complex on the edge of a city. The arrest was quiet, without resistance. Cade sat in the interrogation room, leaning back in his chair as though the weight of the charges barely registered. When questioned about Daniel Moore, he admitted to killing him, claiming it was over a dispute that had turned violent. He offered no details about Rachel, only a shrug and a short, flat statement. She saw everything. That was all. The investigators pressed, but he would say no more, his eyes settling into a kind of defiant calm that suggested he knew exactly how much he was willing to give away. Michael heard about Cade's words secondhand from an investigator who had come to update him in person. He had expected something, anything that might bring him closer to the truth about what had happened to Rachel. Instead, he was left with a single, ambiguous statement that opened more questions than it answered. She saw everything. Did that mean she had lived long enough to witness Daniel's death? Had she been with Cade willingly, or had she been trapped by circumstances she couldn't escape? Was she still out there somewhere, or had she vanished into the same silence that had swallowed Daniel? The yellow sleeping bag, once a symbol of safety, had become something else entirely. It was no longer an object that belonged to his daughter. It was evidence, cataloged and stored away in a secure room, its bright fabric dulled and stained by years of secrets. It was a bridge between two lives that had ended, or perhaps only one, and it was the first tangible piece of proof he had held in 4 long years. At night, Michael thought of the lake, of how still the water had been before the divers descended, and of the way the bag had emerged, heavy and dripping, into the daylight. He thought of the fact that it had been there all this time, hidden in plain sight, waiting for someone to notice. And he couldn't help but wonder how many other places held pieces of the truth, unseen and undisturbed, waiting for the right moment to rise to the surface. In the weeks after Thomas Cade's arrest, Michael lived in a strange limbo. The yellow sleeping bag, the confirmation of Daniel Moore's identity, and Cade's cold admission that she saw everything had pushed the case forward in ways no one had expected. Yet the distance between that progress and the truth about Rachel felt as wide as it had ever been. Detectives worked through the fragments, retracing steps taken 4 years earlier, combing over motel records, bank transactions, and witness statements. Cade was charged with Daniel's murder, but when it came to Rachel, there was nothing concrete to hold on to, only absence and suggestion. Michael sat through every update, absorbing each detail no matter how small, refusing to let the image of her fade. He thought often about how Daniel's remains had surfaced only because of chance, a fisherman's wandering eye, the gleam of color in still water, and he wondered if Rachel's trail was out there in some other form, lying dormant in the shadows, waiting to be found. The turning point came quietly. A detective from the task force, a man named Howard who had taken a personal interest in the case, called Michael one evening to say they were expanding the search beyond the areas that had been combed in the initial operation. He explained that with Cade's arrest, they had reason to believe there were locations tied to him that had not been properly examined. One of those was deep in a section of forest that had been bypassed in the early searches, an area difficult to reach because of steep rock formations and heavy undergrowth. 2 days later, a team moving through that section found something wedged in a narrow crevice in the rock, about 3/4 of a mile from any established trail. At first glance, it was nothing more than a weather-beaten trekking pole, its shaft bent at an awkward angle, the metal scuffed and dulled by time. But closer inspection revealed a strip of faded reflective tape wrapped near the tip, and under the grime and moss, they found a partial fingerprint. It matched Rachel's. Michael was at the station when the call came in. He listened as they described the find, his mind fixed on the image of her setting out from the trailhead with those poles in hand, unaware of how the journey would end. The pole was brought in for further examination, and that was when the technicians made the discovery that would change the investigation once more. Beneath the reflective tape, carefully bound to the metal with weather-resistant cord, was a small waterproof USB drive. It took several hours for the forensic team to bypass the corrosion on the drive's connector and retrieve the data stored inside. When the files opened, they found a single video, just over 11 minutes long. Michael was not there when they viewed it for the first time. The lead investigators insisted on reviewing it in private before deciding how to proceed. But when they called him in the following morning, he could see in their faces that whatever they had watched was not just evidence, it was something far more personal. The recording began with the unsteady frame of a camera bouncing against fabric, then lifting suddenly to reveal a canopy of trees overhead. The image shook violently, accompanied by the sound of fast, uneven breathing. Rachel's voice, low and tight with fear, came through in bursts, the words nearly swallowed by the pounding of her footsteps. She was moving quickly, the camera catching glimpses of trunks and undergrowth as she ducked behind a wide tree. There was a pause, her breath slowing just enough for her to risk looking out from her hiding place. The zoom was abrupt, the image pulling tight on a structure partially obscured by trees, a building with weathered siding, its roofline sagging, the kind of roadside lodge that might once have catered to travelers, but now seemed to sag under neglect. Michael recognized it from the photos the detectives had shown him weeks earlier. This was the motel where both Rachel and Daniel had stayed under false names. From behind the tree, Rachel adjusted the camera's focus toward the rear of the building. A man stepped into view, dragging something heavy from the open trunk of a car. The shape was wrapped in dark fabric, limp at the edges. His face was not fully visible, but the set of his shoulders, the way he moved, and the sound of his voice muttering to himself, a low, rough cadence, were enough for investigators to identify him as Cade. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the scene, and for a moment he glanced around before disappearing through a side door with his burden. The video shifted abruptly, the image whipping downward as Rachel moved again, the jolt of her steps rattling the frame. Her breathing grew faster, harsher, as though she knew she had only moments. Then she turned the camera toward herself. Her face filled the frame, eyes wide, strands of hair clinging to her skin with sweat. Her voice was hurried, the words tumbling out but clear. She said her name full, deliberate, and she said she had no way out. She told whoever found the recording to tell her father that she wasn't a coward, that she hadn't run away. She said she just wanted to leave, but something had gone terribly wrong. There was no trembling in her voice by the end, only a strange steadiness, as if she understood that this was the last thing she would be able to leave behind. A loud noise cut through the moment, a sharp impact, as though someone had grabbed the camera or struck it. The frame spun wildly, a smear of movement in shadow, and then went black. Michael watched the video in a small, windowless room at the station. His hands gripped the edge of the table as the screen lit with her face, her voice carrying across 4 years of silence. It was the closest thing to being in her presence since the day she disappeared, and it hit him with a force that left his chest aching. Fear was there, yes, but so was defiance, the quiet courage he had always known in her. For the investigators, the recording was a breakthrough. It tied Cade directly to Daniel's death and placed Rachel at the scene as a witness. The district attorney's office moved to add new charges: witness intimidation, unlawful detention, and suspicion of homicide. Cade's lawyers fought the admissibility of the footage, but the court ruled it could be used. The video reignited the search for Rachel's remains. Teams returned to the forest and surrounding hills, deploying drones over ridgelines and sending divers into creeks and ponds. The terrain was combed with fresh determination, but the weeks passed without any further discoveries. The possibility that her body might never be found became a shadow over every conversation, an unspoken acknowledgement between Michael and those working the case. Yet for Michael, the recording was more than evidence. It was proof that in her final moments, she had fought to leave a trace, to ensure that someone would know what had happened. She had not allowed herself to vanish without a word. In the 11 minutes captured on that drive, she had reclaimed a part of her story from the silence that Cade had tried to impose. At home, Michael watched the video again and again, not out of morbid need, but because it felt like holding on to her for just a little longer. He studied the way her eyes moved, the way she steadied her voice when she spoke his name. It didn't bring peace. He doubted anything ever could, but it gave shape to the truth, and that, in its own way, was a kind of justice. The case against Cade would move forward, now fortified by the one thing he hadn't been able to bury: her message. And though the forest still held its secrets, and the answers to the most painful questions remained out of reach, Michael knew that Rachel had faced the end with the same quiet strength she had carried all her life. That knowledge would have to be enough. It was not an ending he could accept, but it was the one she had left him. And in its clarity, it was more than he had dared hope for after so many years in the dark. If this story moved you, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss what's coming next. Watch our next video to discover another powerful journey, and explore our other videos for more stories like this. And please, share this one with someone who needs to hear it.